It was just another night shift for me, a truck driver, making my way across the state of Washington. I had been preparing for it all day. I started my morning by doing a pre-trip inspection on my truck, making sure everything was in working order before setting off on my journey. I had a good breakfast and a cup of coffee before leaving my home. I knew I had a long haul ahead of me, so I made sure to get a good rest the night before and be well rested and alert. As I hit the road early in the morning, I felt a sense of excitement and adventure. The sun was shining and the roads were clear, making for an easy drive. I had been on the road for hours. I enjoyed the scenery as I drove, taking in the sights and sounds of the countryside. I stopped for lunch and a break, fueling up and stretching my legs before continuing on my journey. I listened to music and enjoyed the scenery as I drove, making good progress. But as I was heading from Seattle to Yakima, the weather started to change, the sky grew darker and the wind picked up. I had been on the road for several hours and was approaching the remote and deserted area where my truck broke down. I just pulled off and tried to fix it, but it was of no use. I sat in my truck for hours, waiting for another vehicle to pass by, but it was in vain. I had nothing to do but to wait. After about 4 hours of waiting, I realized that I couldn't just sit there and wait for someone to rescue me. I tried to call for help on my CB radio, but I couldn't get a signal. I was completely alone and it was freezing cold outside. I knew that I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. So I assessed my situation. I had some supplies in my truck such as food and water, but I knew I couldn't stay there for long. Eventually, I decided to start walking in the hope of finding help. I was wearing a thick jacket and boots, and I had a hand light with me. I knew that I would be able to make it through the night. But after walking for some time, I found myself stranded in the middle of thick, dark woods. The trees were towering above me, blocking out most of the moonlight. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. The eerie silence made me feel small and insignificant. The forest was so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I felt like I was lost in a maze, with no sense of direction. As I walked, I felt like something was following me. I heard a growl from behind. I immediately froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was there. I slowly turned around, but all I could see was a thick wall of bushes. I couldn't tell what was making that growling sound, but it didn't sound friendly. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I knew I had to get out of there as soon as possible. I quickly got up and started to walk, but then I heard it again, the growl. This time it was louder and closer. I picked up my pace and started to run as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, I just focused on getting to safety as quickly as possible. I ran for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs aching. I had no idea what was following me, but I knew I had to keep going. I had to get out of there. As I ran, I could hear the growling getting louder and closer. I could feel something breathing down my neck. I knew I had to find a way to defend myself. I searched for a stick or a rock, anything to use as a weapon. But there was nothing. I was defenseless. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I saw it, a clearing up ahead. I pushed myself harder, running as fast as I could. And finally, I made it to the clearing. I collapsed on the ground, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked behind me, but there was nothing there. I lay there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. I realized that I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the trailhead. But I didn't care, I was just happy to be alive. I slowly got up and started to walk. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small town and saw the lights. It was a relief. I knocked on the door of the first house I came to, and a kind woman answered. She immediately took me in and called a tow truck to come and get my truck. She also let me use her phone to call my company and let them know what had happened. The next day, the tow truck arrived and I was finally able to get back on the road. I was grateful for the woman's kindness and the help she had given me. I knew that I had been lucky to survive, and I made a mental note to always be prepared for the unexpected. From that night on, I made sure to check my truck and supplies before starting any long haul. I thanked the woman and gave her some money as a token of appreciation before I left. I drove away, back on the road, feeling grateful and relieved. That night stranded in nowhere taught me the importance of being prepared and the kindness of strangers. It also reminded me that sometimes the only way out of a difficult situation is to take action and not just wait for someone to rescue you, and also to trust my instincts and act on them. The thick dark woods had a way of playing with my mind, but I was able to overcome it and find my way to safety. The experience was both terrifying and enlightening. It made me realize the fragility of life and the importance of being prepared for anything that may come our way. But to this day, I couldn't help but wonder what had been following me. Was it a wild animal? A bear or a mountain lion? Or was it something else? Whatever it was, I knew I never wanted to experience something like that again. It was an early morning in Ohio, and I had been up since before the sun rose. I was moving my family from Vegas to Ohio, and we had rented a moving truck to transport all of our belongings. I had been on the road for several hours, and my wife and kids were taking turns sleeping in the back of the truck. I had always dreamed of settling down in Ohio, close to my parents and childhood friends. My wife and I had talked about it for several years, but it wasn't until our kids were old enough to understand the move that we finally made the decision to leave Las Vegas. We spent several months planning and preparing for the move. We had to figure out how to transport all of our belongings, find a new home, and make arrangements for our jobs and the kids' schools. We also had to consider the cost of living, the culture, and the quality of life in Ohio compared to Las Vegas. We researched various moving companies, but eventually decided to rent a moving truck. We wanted to save money and have more control over the move. We also wanted to have the option of making stops along the way to visit friends and family. The day of the move finally arrived, and I was up before the sun rose. I had rented the moving truck, and my wife and kids were taking turns sleeping in the back. We were all excited, but also a little nervous about the long journey ahead of us. We packed all of our belongings carefully, making sure that everything was secure and protected during the trip. We also made sure that we had enough food and drinks for the journey. The kids were especially excited about the snacks and toys that we had packed for them. The first few hours on the road were a little rough, but we soon got into a rhythm. My wife and I took turns driving, and the kids slept or played games in the back. We made several stops along the way to stretch our legs and take in the scenery. As we drove through the Midwest, we marveled at the rolling hills, the quaint small towns, and the lush green forests. I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and nervousness. This was a big change for our family, and I wanted to make sure that everything went smoothly. I was driving through a very desolate area, and there was nothing but fields and trees as far as the eye could see. The morning had been relatively uneventful, but as the sun began to rise, I noticed that the truck was starting to make strange noises. I pulled over to the side of the road and opened the hood to take a look. I wasn't a mechanic, but I knew enough to know that the engine was in trouble. I tried to fix the problem, but it was no use. I called a tow truck, and I was relieved when they told me that they would be there in just a few hours. I didn't want to spend the whole day waiting for the truck to be repaired, but there was nothing I could do. I made the best of the situation and tried to enjoy the peace and quiet of the countryside. The tow truck finally arrived, and I was relieved when the driver told me that the engine was simply overheating and that he could fix it quickly. He worked on the truck for about an hour, and then we were back on the road. I was grateful for the quick and efficient service, and I felt much better knowing that the truck was in good condition. We drove for several more hours, and I was beginning to get tired. I was about to suggest that my wife take over when I saw something in the sky. At first, I thought it was a bird or a plane, but as we got closer, I realized it was something much more unusual. The object was hovering above the road, and it was shaped like a tic-tac. I had never seen anything like it before. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart racing with excitement and a hint of fear. My wife turned to me, her eyes wide with confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, and I pointed to the object above us. For the next 5 minutes, we watched in awe as the object hovered above the road, seemingly motionless. It had a smooth, rounded surface and a glossy finish that gleamed in the sun. I felt as though I was looking at something from another world, something not of this earth. But as much as I was fascinated by the object, fear was starting to set in. I couldn't explain what I was seeing, and the longer we stayed, the more uneasy I felt. I decided it was time to leave, and I put the car back into gear and began to drive away. To my horror, the object began to follow us. It was as if it had come to life, following us as we drove down the road. My wife screamed and grabbed onto my arm, and I could feel the fear radiating from her. We drove as fast as we could, but the object kept pace with us, never straying more than a few hundred meters away. For what felt like an eternity, we drove with the object following us, the fear and uncertainty growing with each passing moment. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the object disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, as if it had never existed. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road and let out a sigh of relief. My wife was shaking, tears streaming down her face as she clung to me. "What was that?" she asked, and I had no answers for her. We sat in the truck for what felt like hours, trying to process what we had just experienced. Was it a UFO? Was it a government experiment? Or was it something else entirely? I didn't know, and I still don't know to this day. Finally, after several days on the road, we arrived in Ohio. We were exhausted yet terrified after what happened. Nevertheless, we found our rental home in a quiet neighborhood, close to the schools and shops that we needed. We also found jobs that allowed us to use our skills and experience, and we enrolled the kids in new schools. Now, several years later, I am happy to say that we are all thriving in Ohio. My wife and I have found fulfilling careers, and our kids are doing well in school and in their extracurricular activities. We are also involved in our local community, and we are proud to call Ohio our home. But I will never forget the feeling of being watched and pursued by an unknown object in the sky. It was a strange and unsettling experience, and one that has stayed with me to this day. And while I may never know what we saw on that deserted road, I know that it was something that changed us forever. As a truck driver, I spend long hours on the road, hauling loads of goods across the country. It's a lonely job, but it also has its perks. There's something peaceful about being on the open road, with nothing but the hum of the engine to keep you company. but one night shift on a Connecticut highway stands out as particularly memorable. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods. The roads were slick with rain, and visibility was poor. I was making my way down Route 84, a stretch of highway that cuts through the heart of Connecticut, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the raw power of nature. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started as a subtle sensation, like someone was following me just out of view. But as I drove on, the feeling grew stronger and stronger. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was never anyone there. I tried to shake it off and told myself it was just my imagination. As the night went on, the sense of unease became overwhelming. I started to see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving in the darkness, ghostly figures lurking on the side of the road. I couldn't tell if it was the storm playing tricks on my mind or if there was something truly sinister afoot. Finally, I came to a long stretch of road that was under construction. The lane was closed, and I had to slow down to a crawl as I made my way through the construction zone. And that's when it happened. I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It was a woman, dressed in white, with long black hair that was plastered to her face by the rain. She was standing in the middle of the road, staring straight at me. I swerved to avoid hitting her, but she was gone as suddenly as she had appeared. I pulled over to the side of the road and sat there, trying to steady my breathing. I knew I should have been terrified, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was trying to tell me something. I spent the rest of the night shift in a state of heightened anxiety, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the darkness for any sign of the mysterious woman. But she never appeared again. When I finally made it back to the truck stop, I told my fellow drivers about my experience. They just laughed and told me it was probably just a hallucination caused by fatigue. But I knew what I saw, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something sinister at work on that stretch of highway. I couldn't shake the memory of that woman in white, and it consumed my thoughts for days. I began to research the area, trying to find out if there were any reported sightings of ghostly figures on that stretch of highway. To my surprise, I found several accounts of people claiming to have seen a ghostly woman dressed in white on that very road. Some even claimed that she was a spirit of a woman who had died in a car accident on that stretch of highway. I couldn't believe it. I had to know more. I decided to take a drive down the same route I had been on the night of my encounter. I wanted to see if I could find any clues that would help explain what I had seen. I left early in the morning and made my way down the highway. The weather was clear and the sun was shining. I felt a sense of unease as I approached the spot where I had seen the woman in white. I slowed down as I passed through the construction zone. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of my truck. I walked around, trying to find any signs of the woman I had seen, but there was nothing there. To this day, I was filled with questions, wondering about the nature of what I was experiencing and if there were any answers to be found. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this experience than met the eye.